This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. I'm so excited to be able to introduce today's guest and to have this conversation. You've probably been reading quite a bit about the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Trust and wondering, what exactly is it? And how did this come about? And what is it going to do? And today's guest, I hope, I think, can give us all of the answers. Yen Liu is Deputy General Counsel of the IMF and has worked at the fund for over 20 years. We met several years ago and really bonded when we were working on a sovereign debt handbook for the African Legal Support Facility, and we were locked in a hotel in Oxford for a week to produce the handbook. Yen, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's really a pleasure.
Jill, thank you very much for really having me. I'm really a big fan of your podcast and found it very informative. So it is a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I know your time is very precious, and we are all very, very busy these days. So I'm going to try to keep us to hopefully 30 minutes. But if you've been a listener to the podcast, you know that we often blow right through that and are trying to keep to the hour mark. But we're going to try to keep this as concise as possible. So to do that, let's just jump right in. Right before the spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF in April, the board of the IMF approved the creation of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. Can you first, just for all of us, just tell us a little bit what the vision was and what the motivation was behind the RST?
Yeah, sure. The world is really facing many pressing challenges, from the pandemic, climate change, spillovers from geopolitical shocks, digitalization, changing demographics, just to name a few. So all these challenges pose an enormous impediment for balance of payment stability and also resilient and sustainable growth, especially for low-income countries and vulnerable middle-income countries. And the pandemic squeezed this country's financial and policy buffers even more, and many of them now are facing food and energy shocks. So the question for the international community is how to help these countries to fight against the pandemic, but also to meet the longer-term structural challenges. So I need to take a step back. As you know, last August, the IMF made the largest allocation of special drawing rights, or SDRs, in history. It's about $650 billion. It was an important part of the IMF's response to the pandemic by supplementing our member countries' foreign exchange reserves and enabling them to reduce their reliance on more expensive domestic or external debt for building reserves. At the time of SDR allocation, many recipient countries with strong external positions expressed interest in voluntarily channeling part of their SDR allocations to support recoveries in poor and vulnerable countries.
Because the way the SDRs are allocated is that it actually goes to the wealthier countries. So even though there was this big gesture in the allocation of the SDRs, the nature of the SDR is that they are created according to one's quotas. So the larger, or the countries with the larger GDPs get the larger allocations.
So advanced economies receive the largest share, about 58%.
Okay.
So I think you're absolutely right on that. I also want to say that this is actually not new, meaning the rechanneling of SDRs. They have done that in the past, have historically used some of their SDR holdings to help countries in need.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So they asked the IMF to explore options to channel SDRs so as to amplify the effect of SDR allocation this time around.
Right.
We looked at several options, including scaling up the existing PRGT, as you know, a trust to help low-income countries. But after much discussion and consultations with stakeholders, setting up a new trust at IMF gained broad support. That is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, or we call RST. Maybe I just touch upon very briefly the objectives of the RST. The RST's central objective is to support countries to tackle longer-term structural challenges through affordable longer-term financing and also policy reforms. It aims to help augment policy space and financial buffers to mitigate macro critical risks associated with those structural challenges and also boost policy space. As we all know, addressing these challenges requires front-loading measures, right, that has immediate fiscal cost and also may lead to debt buildup and fiscal vulnerabilities over the short and medium term. But the benefits would take much longer to materialize.
So what we're saying is that there are actually these long-term issues, such as climate change, pandemics, other kind of development needs, perhaps, that aren't solved in an immediate program or something else. And so this is really kind of breaking new ground for the IMF, and that you're normally kind of coming into a situation to kind of stabilize an emergency situation or BOP crisis. And this one is looking at kind of these longer structural things that are going to cost a lot right now in the upfront, but will benefit the stability longer term, correct?
Our existing lending toolkit really focused on addressing short to medium term balance of payment needs, right? We have this extended, fund facilities. Actually, it also covers structural changes. But I think the challenges we're talking about here are much longer even than that, right? It takes, 10 years, maybe 20 years to do it. I think you're absolutely right. You have to invest so much now, but you won't see the benefits, many years later. So in this process, this affordable, lower cost lending will really help countries address this much longer term structural challenges. We also recognize the financing for RST is not enough. You do need more. So we're also hoping that the policy reforms undertaken by countries can catalyze lending from other sources, from other private creditors or from the other, bilateral, multilateral, lending institutions. Maybe even can catalyze green financing, right? So I think this is a bit, I would say, catalytic role played by RST financing.
Okay. And then who is eligible for these longer term loans? Like, how is eligibility determined? I mean, the headline numbers are that 75% of the IMF membership is now eligible. So, and that's based on some sort of income eligibility, or is there an application, or how is that developed, and how is that going to work?
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question. So RST is targeted at low-income countries, vulnerable middle-income countries, and small states because they face higher risks to prospective balance payment stability. So we analyzed a range of methodologies to define PRGT eligibility, and eventually decided to use a combination of per capita income test. This is using the IDA operational cutoff as the base, and also the population size to capture small states. And we thought this combination is most appropriate metrics. And this also helped balance the resource constraints and also achieving a broad as possible, channeling of SDRs, and also looking at the challenges facing by all these countries. And I have to say these metrics are also used for determining eligibility for the poverty reduction or growth trust as well. This is another trust that we have. So I won't get into the specifics. So we do have a formula to look at that. So based on these metrics, about 3/4 of the IMF's membership, to be very precise, as you mentioned, is 143 countries, were determined by the IMF Executive Board to be eligible initially, right? This is the outset of this trust. And eligibility will be reviewed periodically, and more countries can be added to the list.
But it doesn't necessarily include any metric for vulnerability to climate change, for instance, or other kind of specific environmental, like ecosystem importance or anything like this. This is purely the first hurdle is an income test, so per capita income.
It's a combination of both per capita income and population. Yeah, I think that actually brings me back to the objective. As you know, we talk about the objective of this trust, but the board really determined two, we call qualifying structural challenges. One is the climate, the other is the pandemic preparedness. So they identified two for now. But in determining the eligibility, we don't take into consideration the climate or environmental, specific issues into consideration. Yeah.
So it's really about kind of need in terms of resources.
Yeah, we're targeting at the group, right, rather than sort of like individual country just based on its climate challenges per se.
No, and then the countries have to be, as far as I understand, in an IMF program or.
Exactly. So the RST really complements our existing, lending facilities, but it doesn't lend on its own. So it is almost like a top up, right, on our traditional lending. So that means that when we disperse RST resources, the qualifying member or eligible member, so I'm going to talk about qualification, the eligible member must have a concurrent arrangement, or we call IMF supported program, under the existing facilities. So to answer your other question about application, indeed, the country needs to make a request for an arrangement under the RSF. But when they do that, they also have to meet certain qualification requirements. So there are three qualification criteria. The first one is that the authorities need to propose a set of high quality reform measures to address the structural challenges. Ideally, this country already, designed them in coordination, maybe with other stakeholders, and they're already implementing. But if they don't, we do need to engage them to agree on a set of policy measures.
But that's not necessarily kind of when we think about kind of the green finance and sustainable debt, we're not talking about projects. We're not saying, oh, we want to fund this project. It's truly reform measures. So this is something that they would be kind of a deeper program of development of what they're wanting to fund.
Exactly, because the RST financing is a policy-based. It's not specific project-based financing, right? We can talk a little bit more about conditionality, right? What kind of measures are we talking about? I can give you a couple of examples as well. Maybe I'll just go through the qualification.
Yeah, the qualifications.
So that's the first one. The second one, as I just noted, the RST borrowing requires a concurrent program supported by IMF's traditional or existing facility. The purpose of this requirement is really severalfold. First, also, as I mentioned, RST complements the existing toolkit and prevent facility shopping. And second is really to help ensure a stable macroeconomic environment in order to allow this policy reform to be very effective, and also support the catalytical role that I just mentioned, that's the RST lending plays. So generally about 18 months is required to be left in this concurrent program. But if a country doesn't have an existing arrangement, then you need to, request another concurrent arrangement, for example, under standby arrangement or another facility. But 18 months is the requirement.
But is that at the moment of contracting the first loan through the RST? So, I mean, because if the lending is 10 or 20 years, it's longer term. Do I have to be in an IMF program for the next 20 years? It's just in the beginning.
Yeah, so the RST arrangement is only about 18 months, at least 18 months. When we talk about 20 years, we're talking about repayment period, the maturity period. It's not the program is 20 years, right? So the maturity is 20 years with 10 and a half years of grace period. But the program, RST supported program is much shorter. And also the financing will be dispersed in tranches. But upon approval of an arrangement RST, you don't get any financing, because we do need to see a bit the implementation, of your policy commitment. So no financing will be dispersed, at least under the RST. You can get financing under standby arrangement, on other things, but not on RST. Finally, the standard IMF lending safeguards would apply. For instance, debt stability. Under our policy, as you know very well, we cannot lend if a member's debt is assessed to be unsustainable. Also, the capacity to repay requirement is also applies, to RST. So that is the qualification requirement. So there's eligibility, qualification requirements.
Right. So if I've jumped the hurdles and I'm eligible and I fit the criteria and I'm in an IMF program and my debt has already either been put on a sustainable path or always was sustainable or determined to be sustainable. And I feel that my country, I've got these reform measures that need to be kind of much more longer term, much more structural, then I would apply and say, I would like to apply for this assistance through the RST. And then there's a program period that, as you say, is concurrent with my IMF program where, and we'll get to this, the conditionalities that would be applied, but the IMF would be dispersing kind of the loan to me over 18 months, you say, and then the repayment or something.
Yeah, about 18 months, and could be longer. Yeah.
Okay, and then we got the 10-year grace period and longer repayment period.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got the basics down.
Yeah.
So what are the conditions?
Okay, so now
tell me the hard part.
Yeah, now we get to this famous conditionality, right? So
exactly.
I think basically the conditionality in the strict sense will take the form of reviews by the executive board assessing the implementation of reform measures that we just mentioned. And very similar to our standard structural conditionality, under the typical IMF supported program, reform measure under the RST program could be a single policy action or could be a set of very closely related, actions. So just to give you an example, the reform measures could include for approving a national adaptation plan. And this plan needs to identify climate vulnerabilities and also solutions. Or the measure could be issuing regulations or carbon pricing policy, right? So it's very specific, it's very detailed, and really designed to address the longer term structural challenges. So in designing this reform measure, we really need to coordinate with other financial institutions. For example, World Bank, we're conducting a country assessment, right? So climate assessment. So we do need to consult with them in terms of how to design the appropriate reform measures so as to also help catalyze additional financing. I also want to stress that the reform measures under the RST arrangement will be specified separately from the conditionality under the concurrent IMF support program. So there are two separate sets. However, there could be cases where maybe one policy measure will be relevant for both, right? So even you're saying this is a longer term, but it could still help achieve the objectives of our, for example, standby arrangement, and which means helping to address the underlying BOP problems now. So in that case, the reform measure will be included in both programs. So in other words, the program under RST and the program under the concurrent, program, they need to stand on their own.
But yet there might be some.
There may be linkages. There
may be linkages or overlapping.
Yeah, but they need to be justified on its own.
But if you go off track, sorry, just if you think of the downside scenario, you could go off track on your IMF program, and that would jeopardize everything, I imagine. But if you go off track on your IST, but if you were still current on your IMF program?
Excellent question, because we spent a lot of time looking really at these linkages, between these two programs, right? It's not that easy because it's a kind of a top-on. They're linked, but at the same time they operate, differently. The RST operation, as I mentioned, are designed to run in parallel, right, with the current program. So an RSF or RST review would take place at the same time as the review under the concurrent program to ensure the concurrent program will be on track and benefits really from the synergy. So in a way, it's one directional. So if there's a slippage on the RSF side or RST side, it will not really affect the accompanying program. But the delays for example, in a review under, let's say, a standby arrangement, that would really affect the completion of the review under the RST.
If I'm under my RST program and the conditionality there is, as you were saying, kind of adopting this policy, some carbon policy, and I didn't get it done, right? I just it turned out to be harder, it's stuck in Parliament or whatever. The rest of my IMF program, assuming that wasn't one of my conditions in my IMF program, could keep ticking along.
Exactly.
But I could stumble and kind of have to sit down and have a more difficult review on the RST.
Yeah. So you could delay the RST review until you finish the measure. In the lay person work, you just skip that review, right? So you continue implementing when you're done. Then you basically have sort of, for lack of better word, combined review at the next one.
Right. Now, is this going to be the same mission in just different teams, or is this, or we haven't really figured that out yet?
Yeah, we haven't really discussed in detail about that. But I would think that, for the efficiency purposes, you may want to have one mission covering all these issues. Of course, you need to bring experts, right, to the team. But I have to say, we haven't really discussed sort of the detail, but we did recognize the IST part does require special expertise. And also, as I mentioned, a very close collaboration with other institutions.
Okay. And then the borrowing, coming back to kind of the proceeds of the loan that I would get under the RST, that is free use of proceeds in the sense of it's just general support. I mean, passing legislation, for instance, and to stick with that same example, doesn't, so I could be using that money. I have to obviously use it properly and well in my budget, but it's not ring fenced for any particular, going back to my other question earlier, it's not for a particular project.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, as you mentioned, the proceeds must be used consistent with the objectives, right? We have a trust, we set up a trust. So we have a trust instrument. Article 1 of the instrument specifies how you can use the proceeds. So you have to be consistent with that, right? And I think you're getting to the point that whether we can earmark, right, the resources. No, we cannot. And it can be used for the general budget, support. For instance, just, is provided really as a liquid and fungible balance of payment support. So as long as you use the money in a way that's consistent with the purpose, with the provisions of the trust.
And when you were talking about this money being catalytic for bringing in private sector and things, is your thinking really just because you're improving the environment in the country and there's more kind of engagement and scrutiny and monitoring going on? Or is there actual some linkage of, okay, we're going to provide this money and it is either expected that the government will, or the private sector is going to match it in some way, or is that still kind of being considered? And
all I can say is that we really hope our lending will catalyze the financing for others, but it's not a requirement. You know what I mean? It's not like as a condition for us to provide RST financing, we need contributions from the private sector, from other institutions. And we really hope that the policy reforms, accompanied by monitoring, also accompanied by concurrent program to address the balance payment vulnerabilities, right, for the short and medium term, all this to get as a package will really send not only a strong signal, to other stakeholders that the country is implementing the right policy and is committed, right, to implementing the longer term sort of policies, or at least committed to meeting the challenges, and give some confidence, right, to the other institutions or stakeholders to really help this country. Because we do recognize, we haven't talked about the access level, but the money is not a lot, and the country really need much more in order to really tackle those challenges. Maybe I will just also quickly mention that, as you know, we have precautionary arrangements, meaning country requests the arrangement, but they don't draw under it, right? But this one, we really expect all the arrangements to be drawing arrangements, meaning you cannot use it on a precautionary basis.
And then in terms of timing, and you're hoping that by October that this is going to become operational. When we say that, does that mean you're already in discussions with some countries and kind of launching it in November or October? Or does that mean you're going to start reviewing applications in October?
Right now, we expect the RST to be operational on the condition that we really receive a critical mass of contributions, right? Where SDR, voluntary SDR contributions from our countries. I think, as with any of our lending facility, of course, we don't want to create a facility without any interest from countries. So we have to get a sense whether there's any interest where, in using this facility. So in that context, yes, we do get, we did consult, our member countries and also, sense their interest. And I think that process will be ongoing. As to whether we can really sort of, approve arrangement right away, I think that yet to be seen, because after we couldn't really to front run, the whole process. For example, allow country to apply because the trust existed, but there's no money, right? So we have to wait until it becomes operational. Then we can, start the process.
Yeah. So first you have to get it all up, then you have to get the money actually in.
Exactly. Yeah, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't really do a lot of preparation work, right? Or, like we're saying, testing. You ask a very good question about missions. We can think about all these issues before it becomes operational.
And the countries that are contributing, the wealthier countries that are saying, okay, we'd like to reallocate our SDRs into this RST, do they have any say in either where the money is going to, which countries, priorities, or the programs, or they've just kind of outsourced all of that to the IMF?
Yeah. I think at least as of now, they entrusted the fund, right? We're the trustee, the executive. The fund is the trustee of the fund. Of course, they need to agree to for example, the trust instruments, right? That's established the trust, which defines all the features. I think we gave them, I can only say we gave them a lot of safeguards. For example, if you add more qualifying sort of challenges or events that could be covered by the trust, we do need to get their consent. So there are certain safeguards built in to protect the contributors. But at the same time, if the trustee has also a lot of authority and power to manage the trust based on the trust instrument, which they already agreed to. So it is I guess it's a combination, right? So the protection plus the authority. So it is not like they can dictate us saying that, oh, regardless what you have in the trust instrument, I only want you to lend to a specific country. They can't do that.
Will there be a limit of how many countries can come forward in a particular, like if you have a flood of countries, I suppose it'll just be the amount of the resources in the trust.
Yeah, there's no limit on how many countries can come, but we use the access limits, right, for lack of better words, to ensure the proper allocation among all the countries in need. So there's a cap on the RSP resources, which is the lower of 150% of a member's quota, or SDR 1 billion. And of course, the access will be guided by an access norm. Norm is just a guidance. It's not an actual ceiling or anything, which is 75% of a country's quota. So whenever you go above or go under, you'll also be guided by a set of factors like the strength of their policy reform, their ability to repay the fund, any direct short to medium term balance payment needs arising from the measures, the corresponding policy reforms. So there are a bunch of factors we have to take into account when we deciding a specific country's access level.
And then the last question, because and this is kind of my favorite, but I think we've already touched on it, but in terms of debt sustainability, it's because the country would already have to be in an IMF program. If their debt was determined to be unsustainable, it would have already had to been addressed or gone through the financing assurances, same sort of process for the IMF program. With the same sort of policies around arrears and all of that, like, so if I'm getting into my IMF program and I'm still doing my debt restructuring, I could, if I'm in that IMF program, I'm free to go on the RST.
Right. So I think that's why we require concurrent, IMF program. So a lot of these policies, not a lot of, all of the policy actually you mentioned would apply to that program already. So, you don't really need to sort of apply separately because they're working together, right? As I said, RST is more, for lack of a better word, is really the additional resources on top of the IMF supporting program under the traditional, for lack of a better word, traditional facilities. So they do apply, but you don't need to assess really under this one.
Again, to keep to my promise about the time, I want to say, thank you so much for coming here today and to explaining this RST. We're all very excited about this development, and we look forward to October to seeing it in operation and kind of seeing the benefit to countries. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Really my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.